History is full of strange wars, but few are as absurd and oddly entertaining as the Great Emu War of 1932. No, this isn't a joke. Australia's military really did wage a campaign against an army of large, flightless birds, and lost. The backdrop to this unlikely battle was Western Australia in the early 1930s. After World War I, the government encouraged returning soldiers to settle in rural areas and take up farming. These veterans were given land to grow wheat, but life wasn't easy. By 1932, the Great Depression had caused wheat prices to crash. Farmers were struggling to make ends meet. Then, to make matters worse, a new enemy arrived: thousands of emus. Each year, emus migrate from the inland toward the coast. In 1932, around 20,000 of them descended on farmlands in the Campion district, drawn by water and freshly planted crops. To the farmers' horror, these giant birds tore through their wheat fields, trampling fences and gobbling grain. Emus might look awkward, but they're surprisingly tough. They can run up to 50 km/h, change direction in a heartbeat, and survive in harsh conditions. Farmers tried to scare them off, but nothing worked. Desperate, they called on the government for help. The government responded by sending the military. In November 1932, Major G.P.W. Meredith arrived with 2 soldiers, 2 Lewis machine guns, and 10,000 rounds of ammunition. The plan was simple: find the emus, open fire, and solve the problem. But nature doesn't always play by the rules. The first battle happened near Campion. The soldiers spotted a group of about 50 emus and set up their guns. As soon as the shooting started, the birds scattered in every direction. They were fast, unpredictable, and hard to hit. Only a handful were killed before the rest vanished into the bush. A few days later, the team tried again, this time spotting over 1,000 emus near a dam. This looked promising until the gun jammed after just a few shots. The birds once again fled unharmed. Realizing they needed more mobility, the soldiers mounted a machine gun on a truck to chase the birds, but the rough terrain made it impossible to aim properly. The emus, agile and quick, easily outran the vehicle. It became clear that this war was not going to be the easy victory anyone had imagined. Over the next weeks, the soldiers engaged the emus in several skirmishes. The birds seemed to operate in small, coordinated groups led by a scout bird, making them difficult to corner. Farmers watching the fiasco started joking that the emus were outsmarting the army. The press caught wind of the story, and headlines mocked the campaign. Articles claimed the emus were winning and described them as having bulletproof feathers and unbreakable morale. Whether exaggerated or not, the truth was that the operation was failing. By early December, the government decided to withdraw the troops. Official numbers suggested that about 1,000 emus had been killed, but this was a small fraction of the estimated 20,000. The crops were still in danger, and the farmers were still frustrated. Major Meredith himself later admitted that the birds were extraordinarily tough opponents. He even remarked that if the Australian army had a division as fast and as resilient as the emus, they could take on any force in the world. After the war's failure, the government introduced a bounty system instead, paying rewards for each emu killed. This method proved far more effective than using the military. Over the next few years, thousands of emus were hunted by farmers, and crop losses were reduced. So why has the Great Emu War remained so famous? Partly because it's such a bizarre reversal of expectations. Humans, with their advanced weapons, are used to dominating nature. But in this case, nature fought back and won, without even knowing it was in a war. It's also a reminder of how unpredictable real-world problems can be. On paper, sending soldiers with machine guns to deal with birds sounds like overkill. In practice, the emus' speed, intelligence, and sheer numbers made them an enemy the military simply couldn't beat. Today, the story is told with humor and disbelief. It's the subject of documentaries, comedy sketches, and endless internet memes. People love it because it's both ridiculous and true, a moment in history where the mighty were humbled by the absurd. The Great Emu War didn't change the course of world events. No territory was gained or lost, no treaties signed. But it left behind a legend that has outlived most serious wars of the same era. It's a tale that combines environmental challenges, human overconfidence, and a touch of slapstick comedy. And if there's a lesson, It might be this: never underestimate your opponent, especially if they have long legs, a fast stride, and no idea they're supposed to lose. In the summer of 1518, the people of Strasbourg, in what is now France, faced a strange and terrifying mystery. It wasn't war, it wasn't famine, it wasn't even a plague in the usual sense. No, this was something far stranger. It was a plague of dancing. It began quietly. On a hot July day, a woman named Frau Trophäa stepped into the street and began to dance. There was no music, no festival, no celebration. She just moved, her arms swinging, her feet stamping against the cobblestones. Neighbours watched, puzzled. Hours passed, and she didn't stop. By nightfall, she was still going. The next morning, she was at it again, and again the next day. Within a week, dozens of people had joined her. Men, women, and even children were moving through the streets, their faces pale with exhaustion, yet their bodies refusing to rest. The city authorities were baffled. This wasn't joyful dancing. It was desperate, feverish, unstoppable. By the end of the month, the number of dancers had swelled to hundreds. Eyewitnesses described people collapsing from exhaustion, their feet bleeding, their bodies shaking. Some even danced themselves to death. The city's leaders struggled to understand what was happening. In the 16th century, science was still deeply intertwined with superstition. Many believed the dancers were cursed, perhaps struck by the wrath of St. Vitus, a Christian saint associated with, ironically, dancing. Others thought it was some kind of madness spreading from person to person. In a move that now seems absurd, the authorities decided that the best cure was more dancing. They reasoned that the afflicted needed to dance it out to be free of the compulsion. They hired musicians, set up a stage in the marketplace, and even brought in professional dancers to keep the rhythm going. Instead of stopping the plague, it made things worse. For weeks, the strange spectacle continued. The summer sun beat down, but the dancers kept moving, driven by a force no one could explain. Some collapsed and never got up. Others danced for days before slipping into unconsciousness. It was chaos. So what really happened in Strasbourg in 1518? Historians have debated the cause for centuries, and there's still no definitive answer. One theory is that the dancers were victims of ergot poisoning, a condition caused by eating rye bread contaminated with a toxic fungus. Ergot contains chemicals similar to LSD, which can cause hallucinations, convulsions, and strange behavior. But there's a problem with that explanation. Ergot poisoning also causes violent muscle spasms and makes movement painful, not endless and rhythmic. And it's unlikely that hundreds of people would all respond to it by dancing in unison. Another theory is mass psychogenic illness, what we might call mass hysteria today. Strasbourg in 1518 was a city under intense stress. Famine, disease, and poverty weighed heavily on the people. Religious fears were high, and belief in curses and divine punishment was widespread. In such an environment, anxiety can spread like wildfire. If one person's mind and body reacted to the pressure by dancing uncontrollably, others, subconsciously influenced, might follow. Some historians even suggest that it was a ritual gone wrong, an attempt to honour St. Vitus that spiralled out of control, feeding on collective fear and superstition until it became a citywide crisis. Whatever the cause, the epidemic eventually burned itself out. By early September, the dancers had slowed, collapsed, or been taken away to a shrine for healing. Life in Strasbourg returned to its normal rhythm, but the memory of that summer lingered. The dancing plague remains one of history's strangest unsolved mysteries. It's been recorded in city documents, church notes, and even medical reports of the time. And it's not the only instance. Similar outbreaks were reported in other parts of Europe in the Middle Ages, though none reached the scale of Strasbourg in 1518. So why does the story still fascinate us? Partly because it's unsettling. We think of ourselves as in control of our own bodies, yet here was a whole community unable to stop moving, even as it harmed them. It blurs the line between body and mind, between disease and belief, between reality and hysteria. It's also a reminder of how little we truly understand about the human mind, and how culture, stress, and environment can shape behavior in ways that seem almost impossible. Could something like this happen again? In a world of social contagion and viral trends, maybe not in the form of deadly dancing, But the idea of mass, unexplainable behaviour isn't as far-fetched as it sounds. The summer of 1518 ended like a fever breaking. The music stopped, the dancers faded away, and Strasbourg's streets were quiet once more. But for weeks the city had moved to an eerie, relentless beat, one that no one could hear, but everyone could feel. And perhaps the most haunting part of the dancing plague is this. For those trapped in its grip, the dancing wasn't joy, it wasn't celebration, it was a prison, one where the bars were made of their own unstoppable steps. In the summer of 1518, the people of Strasbourg in what is now France faced a strange and terrifying mystery. It wasn't war, it wasn't famine, it wasn't even a plague in the usual sense. No, this was something far stranger. It was a plague of dancing. Some military operations are named for generals, battles, or strategies, but in 1976, the United States launched an operation named after a giant lumberjack from American folklore. It wasn't a joke, it was deadly serious, and it all started because of a tree. The setting was the Korean Demilitarized Zone, DMZ, the tense strip of land dividing North and South Korea since the Korean War ended in 1953. Even though the fighting had stopped, the two sides were still technically at war. The DMZ was heavily guarded, and any incident there risked igniting a full-scale conflict. Inside the DMZ was the Joint Security Area, JSA, a small zone where troops from both sides could operate, and where peace negotiations sometimes took place. It was also where one poplar tree became the centre of an international crisis. The tree stood near the Bridge of No Return, partially blocking the view between a United Nations command, UNC checkpoint and an observation post. This was a problem for US and South Korean forces because North Korean guards often used blind spots to move around undetected. The decision was made to trim the tree for better visibility. On August 18, 1976, a team of US Army engineers, escorted by UNC security personnel, set out to prune the branches. But almost immediately, they were confronted by a group of North Korean soldiers. The North Koreans, led by Senior Lieutenant Pak Chul, nicknamed the Bulldog for his aggressive behavior, ordered the Americans to stop, claiming the tree had been planted by North Korea's leader Kim Il-sung and was therefore sacred. The US team ignored the order and continued working. What happened next would become known as the Axe Murder Incident. Pak Chul ordered more soldiers to surround the Americans. Armed with clubs and axes, the North Koreans suddenly attacked. In the chaos, two US officers, Captain Arthur Boniface and First Lieutenant Mark Barrett, were beaten to death. Several others were injured before the North Koreans withdrew. The attack shocked the US military and political leadership. The deaths were seen as an unprovoked act of violence, and the risk of escalation was high. President Gerald Ford's administration faced a delicate choice: retaliate with enough force to send a message, but avoid triggering another Korean War. The response was Operation Paul Bunyan, a massive show of force disguised as a tree-trimming mission. On August 21, 1976, just 3 days after the attack, the US and South Korea put the plan into motion. Early in the morning, a convoy rolled into the JSA. At its core was a team of engineers armed not with rifles but with chainsaws. Their mission? Cut down the poplar tree entirely, not just trim it. But surrounding them was one of the most overwhelming displays of military power ever assembled in the DMZ. The engineers were escorted by 24 Special Forces soldiers with M16 rifles. Behind them were 64 additional troops from the South Korean Special Forces, known for their fierce hand-to-hand combat training. Overhead, attack helicopters circled. B-52 bombers flew high above, flanked by F-4 Phantom fighter jets. On the ground, tanks and artillery units were positioned just outside the DMZ, ready to respond instantly if North Korea made a move. Even an aircraft carrier task force was stationed nearby in the Sea of Japan. The message was clear: if North Korea interfered again, the US and South Korea were prepared for all-out war. North Korean troops watched from a distance, weapons ready, but they didn't act. The engineers went to work, their chainsaws roaring through the poplar trunk. In just 42 minutes, the tree was reduced to a stump about 6 meters tall. The mission was completed without a single shot fired. Afterward, the stump was deliberately left standing, a silent reminder of the incident and the overwhelming response it provoked. Operation Paul Bunyan was a calculated act of psychological warfare. It showed that the US and South Korea could respond with overwhelming strength, yet remain disciplined enough not to spark further bloodshed. The operation's success lay not in combat, but in deterrence. The incident did prompt a change in the rules. After 1976, the Joint Security Area was divided more strictly, with a clear demarcation so soldiers from each side would no longer mingle freely. This reduced the risk of violent confrontations, though tensions in the DMZ remain high to this day. The poplar tree may have been just a plant, but it became a symbol of Cold War brinkmanship. 2 men lost their lives in the axe murder incident, and their deaths nearly pushed the Korean Peninsula back into open war. In the end, Operation Paul Bunyan worked because it balanced strength with restraint. It was a show of force so overwhelming that it left no doubt about US and South Korean resolve, yet it stopped short of actual combat. It's a strange footnote in military history, a mission named after a mythical lumberjack, carried out with chainsaws and backed by bombers, all to send a message over a single tree. But in the tense chess game of the Cold War, sometimes the smallest objects cast the longest shadows. When we think of tornadoes, our minds often leap to the flat plains of the American Midwest, Kansas, Oklahoma, maybe Texas, swirling funnels tearing through endless fields. But Europe, in the Dark Ages? That's hardly the first place you'd expect to find one. And yet, one of the earliest recorded tornadoes in history, and the very first documented in Europe, struck in the year 788 AD during the reign of Charlemagne, forever earning a strange place in medieval chronicles. This was not a time of modern weather science. Meteorology as we know it didn't exist. The people of early medieval Europe looked to the heavens for omens, signs from God, or punishments for earthly sins. Storms were not simply bad weather. They were messages, and the tornado of 788 would be remembered in exactly that way, as a terrifying, divine warning. We know of the event thanks to the Royal Frankish Annals, an official record of Charlemagne's empire. These annals were the medieval equivalent of an official news archive, though reporting in the 8th century was far from neutral. Chroniclers framed events in ways that supported royal authority or divine providence. If nature unleashed chaos, it wasn't just a natural disaster, it was often interpreted as a message to kings. The entry for that year tells of a great whirlwind that descended upon Freising, a settlement in what is now southern Germany. This whirlwind tore through the town with ferocity unlike anything anyone had seen before. The chronicler described it ripping roofs from buildings, flattening wooden structures, and even killing people. It didn't just blow, it roared. It's worth noting that while the text uses whirlwind, many historians believe this was indeed a tornado, not just a powerful gust of wind. Medieval Europe didn't have the scientific terminology we use today, but descriptions of a twisting, funnel-like column of air match our modern definition. Imagine the scene. Narrow streets lined with timber-framed houses, thatched roofs swaying under dark, swelling clouds. The wind picks up, villagers clutch cloaks tighter, animals become restless, and then the sky seems to boil, twisting downwards into a spiraling monster. In moments, the tornado cuts through the heart of the settlement, scattering debris like straw. People are thrown off their feet, livestock vanish into the chaos. The air is filled with an unholy sound, half scream, half roar, as the vortex rips the world apart. For the people of Freising, it must have felt like the end of the world. There were no storm cellars, no weather alerts, no scientific explanations, only raw terror. Once the funnel passed, survivors stepped into a landscape transformed, crops flattened, homes destroyed, neighbours gone. The chronicler's account doesn't just list damage, it frames the event as a divine judgment. This was, after all, a deeply religious age. Charlemagne himself saw his empire as a Christian mission, expanding the faith by sword and law. A violent, unexplained storm fit perfectly into the worldview that God actively intervened in worldly affairs. Whether it was a warning to repent or a punishment for sins, it was interpreted as heavenly business. But why 788 AD? Was this tornado an isolated freak occurrence, or was it part of a larger climatic pattern? While records are sparse, climate historians suggest Europe was entering a period of shifting weather patterns, alternating droughts and storms, possibly linked to volcanic activity or solar cycles. In such conditions, severe storms, even tornadoes, were possible, especially in valleys or regions near mountains, where air currents can become unstable. In a strange way, this tornado also became part of political history. That same year, Charlemagne was embroiled in campaigns to consolidate his empire, facing resistance from Saxons and Bavarians. Nature's fury provided a potent reminder to subjects of the emperor's divine mandate. Even the weather could be seen as supporting, or warning, rulers. The Royal Frankish Annals recording of the event ensured it was not forgotten. Interestingly, this 788 tornado challenges the common assumption that Europe is safe from such violent storms. Tornadoes are rare on the continent, but they do occur. Modern meteorologists have recorded dozens in Europe each year, though most are small compared to the monsters of Tornado Alley. Still, the freezing storm shows that even in the so-called Dark Ages, people were already encountering, and fearing, these twisting tempests. In the centuries that followed, other whirlwinds were recorded in medieval manuscripts, often accompanied by tales of destruction, miraculous escapes, or supernatural explanations. But this 8th century event remains special because it stands at the crossroads of history, weather, and faith, the moment when a natural disaster entered the political and religious narrative of a growing empire. Today, Freising is a peaceful Bavarian town, home to one of the world's oldest breweries and a historic cathedral. Tourists stroll its quiet streets without any hint that over 200 years ago, a roaring funnel of wind brought chaos here. But the Royal Frankish Annals still bear witness to the day the skies twisted into fury, and Europe's first recorded tornado tore its way into history. In the end, the tornado of 788 was more than just weather. It was a story, one that medieval chroniclers shaped into a warning, one that modern historians study as evidence of Europe's climatic past, and one that reminds us how nature's power can bridge the centuries, connecting us to people who, despite living in a different world, knew the same fear of a sky gone dark and wild. In the long, bizarre history of the papacy, few events are as macabre, surreal, and downright unsettling as the Cadaver Synod of 897 AD. It was a trial of a corpse, and not just any corpse, but the body of a former pope. The setting was medieval Rome, a city not of the Romantic Renaissance yet to come, but a turbulent place where politics, religion, and personal vendettas were often the same thing. The papacy in the late 9th century was far from the stable institution we think of today. Instead, it was a dangerous political prize, fought over by powerful Roman noble families and foreign rulers alike. In 891, Pope Formosus became head of the Catholic Church. He was no stranger to controversy. Before becoming Pope, Formosus had clashed with powerful leaders, been excommunicated, and even fled Rome at one point. But as Pope, he navigated a minefield of alliances, supporting one faction, then another, especially in the bitter rivalry between the Carolingian rulers of the Holy Roman Empire and their Italian opponents. When Formosus died in 896, he left behind a papacy in chaos. His successor, Boniface VI, lasted only 15 days before dying, possibly under suspicious circumstances. Then came Pope Stephen VI, also called Stephen VII, a man with a deep grudge against Formosus. Stephen believed Formosus had betrayed the church and broken canon law, but rather than simply condemning him in words, Stephen decided to make his point in the most grotesque way possible. He would put Formosus on trial, even though he was already dead. And so, in January 897, the Cadaver Synod began. Formosus's corpse was exhumed from its tomb in St. Peter's Basilica. By this point, it had been buried for several months and was in a grim state of decay. The body was dressed in full papal vestments, robes, crown and all, and seated upright on a throne inside the Lateran Basilica. To make the spectacle complete, a deacon was appointed to act as the dead pope's defense, answering questions on behalf of the rotting body. The charges against Formosus were serious, at least by church law, violating canon rules by becoming pope while still bishop of another diocese, perjury, and illegally using the papacy for political gain. But the trial itself was a grotesque performance. Witnesses were called, accusations were read, and the corpse sat silently while Pope Stephen, red-faced with anger, shouted questions at it. The deacon, speaking for Formosus, had little chance. Everyone in the room knew the verdict was already decided. Unsurprisingly, the court found Formosus guilty. His election as pope was declared invalid. All his acts, decrees, and ordinations were annulled. The papal garments were ripped from the corpse, and the 3 fingers he had used for blessings were cut off. Finally, the body was dragged through the streets of Rome and thrown into the Tiber River. The spectacle horrified many Romans. Even in an era of brutal politics, the idea of putting a dead pope on trial felt sacrilegious and grotesque. Stephen VI hoped the trial would strengthen his political position, but it had the opposite effect. Public outrage grew, and within months Stephen was deposed, imprisoned, and strangled to death. But the story didn't end there. The next pope, Theodore II, ordered Formosus's body recovered from the river. Miraculously, or so the chroniclers claimed, the corpse was found relatively intact. Formosus was reburied with honour in St. Peter's, and all his acts as pope were reinstated. A few years later, Pope John IX officially condemned the cadaver synod, declaring that no future trials of the dead would be allowed. But the papal politics of Rome remained deadly, and the memory of that grim spectacle haunted the church for centuries. So why did it happen? Historians see it as the extreme end of medieval power struggles. The late 9th century was a chaotic time for the papacy, with popes rising and falling quickly, often depending on the fortunes of the political factions backing them. The cadaver synod wasn't just about theological rules, it was about erasing the legacy of a rival so completely that even death offered no protection. Today, the cadaver synod stands as one of the most infamous moments in church history, a surreal blend of political theatre, religious ritual, and morbid symbolism. It feels almost too strange to be real, a rotting pope, dressed in finery, accused of crimes, and symbolically stripped of dignity in front of the world. It's a reminder of just how far people will go when power, vengeance, and fear collide, and how, in medieval Rome, not even the grave could protect you from your enemies. On an ordinary October afternoon in 1814, the streets of London's St. Giles district suddenly found themselves under attack, not by fire, not by invading troops, but by a tidal wave of beer. Yes, beer. Hundreds of thousands of litres of dark, frothy porter came roaring through the narrow streets, knocking down walls, sweeping people off their feet, and turning a working-class neighbourhood into a chaotic, alcohol-fueled disaster zone. What might sound like the start of a drunken pub tale was, in fact, one of the strangest and deadliest industrial accidents in British history. To understand how something like this could even happen, you have to picture the setting. In the early 19th century, brewing in London was a huge business. Beer wasn't just a drink. For many working-class people, it was part of the daily diet. Water in the city could be dirty and unsafe, but beer, thanks to the boiling process during brewing, was far less risky to drink. Among the giants of the brewing world stood the Moo and Company Brewery, located on Tottenham Court Road. This was no small operation. The brewery specialised in making porter, a dark, strong beer that was wildly popular at the time. To keep up with demand, they stored their beer in gigantic wooden vats, some of them towering as high as a 3-storey building. The largest vat at the Moo Brewery was a monster. It could hold over 600,000 litres of beer. This vat was held together by massive iron hoops, and inside it, beer aged and fermented until it was ready for sale. For years, it stood as a symbol of industrial strength and modern brewing power. But like any giant structure under constant pressure, it had weaknesses. The vat was already showing signs of trouble. One of the iron bands had snapped earlier in the year, though the brewery had simply replaced it and kept going. On the afternoon of October 17, 1814, that weakness became fatal. Around 5:30 p.m, without warning, one of the iron hoops gave way again. The tension was too great, and the wooden vat cracked. In an instant, the pressure from hundreds of thousands of litres of beer caused the entire thing to burst apart. The force was so strong that the sound was said to be heard miles away. And the beer didn't just leak out gently, it exploded. The sheer volume of liquid was staggering. Imagine a massive brown wave taller than a man crashing through narrow streets and small houses. The first thing it hit was another large vat, which collapsed under the impact, releasing even more beer. This created a chain reaction, with multiple vats breaking apart and feeding the flood. In total, over 1.4 million litres of beer were suddenly set loose. St Giles, the neighbourhood surrounding the brewery, was one of London's poorest areas. Many families lived crammed into basement rooms and small wooden homes. As the beer poured out, it rushed into these buildings with terrifying speed. Walls crumbled, roofs collapsed, and anyone caught in its path had little chance to escape. The wave of porter filled basements instantly, trapping those inside. Eyewitness accounts describe scenes of utter chaos. People were knocked over and swept along like rag dolls. Children who had been playing in the street disappeared in the torrent. Mothers desperately tried to grab their families and climb to safety. The smell of beer filled the air, mixing with the cries of the injured and the sound of splintering wood. In the aftermath of the initial surge, the streets were left slick and sticky, with beer pooling in low-lying areas. Neighbours worked frantically to rescue people buried under debris or trapped in flooded rooms. But the tragedy had already claimed lives. At least 8 people were killed. Some drowned in the beer, others crushed by collapsing walls. The victims were almost all women and children, many of them caught in their homes. For many Londoners, the idea of a deadly beer flood was almost impossible to believe. Crowds gathered to see the wreckage at the Moo Brewery, staring at the shattered vats and destroyed houses. Newspapers quickly spread the story, some treating it as a grim warning about industrial safety, others with a tone of morbid fascination. And yet, the flood also sparked strange behaviour. Some residents reportedly tried to collect the beer in pots, pans, and even boots. Others were said to have scooped it straight from the gutters, though this part of the tale might be more urban legend than fact. Still, the incident became a bizarre mix of tragedy and dark humour in the city's history, a disaster that was both ridiculous in its cause and devastating in its effects. But how did the brewery respond? And why did no one face serious punishment for the disaster? Those questions, and the surprising way London remembered the flood, would unfold in the days and weeks that followed. The hours after the flood were filled with chaos, disbelief, and tragedy. Locals rushed to the scene, not just to help, but also to witness the bizarre spectacle of streets drenched in beer. The sweet, yeasty smell hung in the air, mixing with the sharp scent of broken wood and the metallic tang of spilled blood from those injured. Rescue efforts began almost immediately, but the cramped layout of St Giles complicated matters. The area's narrow lanes and haphazard construction meant that floodwater and beer had poured into the lowest points, trapping residents. Many homes were poorly built and collapsed under the force, adding to the destruction. Unfortunately, the flood's victims were not only those caught by the initial wave. Several people drowned in cellars, unable to escape as the beer filled the confined spaces. One particularly heartbreaking story was that of a young girl who had been helping her mother with housework when the flood struck. Their cellar filled in minutes, leaving no time to reach higher ground. Another grim aspect was the aftermath for local families. Many of the victims were from poor households already living on the edge of survival. The loss of breadwinners combined with property damage left them in desperate situations. Public sympathy was strong, but the official response was minimal. Inquests into the deaths determined that the tragedy was a visitation of God, meaning no one was held legally responsible. This ruling meant the Moo and Cumber Brewery faced no penalty, and the families received no compensation. The brewery itself suffered financial loss, but not nearly as much as might be expected. Insurance covered much of the damage, and the company rebuilt quickly. Ironically, the flood's notoriety may have even boosted its name recognition. Still, the incident forced the brewery to reconsider its storage methods. Massive vats like the one that burst became less common, replaced by smaller, safer containers. For the people of St Giles, however, recovery was slow. Some tried to salvage what they could from the sticky ruins, clothing, furniture, and valuables, but much was lost. Others tried to drink from the pools of beer left behind, leading to rumours and likely exaggerations about drunken crowds. While some of these tales were meant to add a touch of absurd humour to the tragedy, they overshadowed the genuine suffering caused by the event. In the months following, the beer flood became a strange blend of horror and curiosity. Newspapers reported it with a mix of sensationalism and moral commentary, some framing it as a lesson in the dangers of industrial excess, others simply marvelling at the sheer oddity of a neighbourhood nearly destroyed by alcohol. The incident also became a talking point in public discussions about urban safety. While the 19th century lacked the strict building codes we have today, the flood highlighted the potential risks of storing massive quantities of volatile liquids in densely populated areas. Yet, it would take many more industrial accidents before meaningful regulations were introduced. Over time, the beer flood faded from mainstream memory, surviving mostly in local lore and the occasional historical anecdote. For those who lived through it, however, it was unforgettable, a moment when ordinary life was interrupted by a disaster so bizarre it seemed almost unreal. Today, the London beer flood is remembered as one of the strangest disasters in history. It stands alongside other odd but deadly incidents, like the Boston molasses disaster of 1919, as proof that not all catastrophes come from storms, fires, or earthquakes. Sometimes human-made structures combined with a bit of bad luck can unleash forces just as destructive. In a way, the story captures the strange duality of history, the ability for an event to be both tragic and absurd. For historians, it offers a glimpse into the everyday risks of 19th century urban life. For the public, it's a reminder that the past was filled with unexpected dangers, some of them as peculiar as a tidal wave of beer sweeping through London's streets. Though the Mew Brewery continued to operate for many years after, the flood became its most infamous legacy. The site where the vat once stood is now long gone, but the story remains, a curious footnote in the history of industrial London, where beer once turned from a source of celebration to a harbinger of destruction. The 19th century was an age of speed. Steam engines cut travel times in half, railways connected distant cities, and most astonishingly, the telegraph made it possible to send messages across continents in seconds rather than weeks. But this incredible leap forward came with its own challenges. Telegraph wires were expensive to operate, operators were paid by the word, and a single sentence could cost the equivalent of an entire day's wages. To solve this, inventors, businessmen, and secret societies turned to something unusual: telegraph code books, vast collections of substitute words and phrases designed to shrink entire paragraphs into a single word. At first, these codes were simple. Instead of writing out "shipment of coal delayed by weather will arrive on Tuesday," a sender might just write "cavern." That single word, when looked up in the recipient's matching codebook, unlocked the entire meaning. The effect was revolutionary. A message that might have cost 10 shillings could now be sent for pennies. Soon, telegraph codebooks grew thicker and more complex, covering every possible industry: shipping, finance, politics, railroads, even personal letters. By the 1860s, merchants could communicate in a secret shorthand that seemed nonsensical to outsiders. Imagine standing in a telegraph office and overhearing, "Please transmit wagon light." To the clerk, it meant nothing. To the recipient, it meant buy 200 barrels of flour if prices are under £3. These codes gave traders an enormous advantage in speed and secrecy. Rivals couldn't simply intercept and understand the messages, since the codes were privately published and closely guarded. But the codes weren't only used for business. Governments quickly realized their power. Diplomats carried code books that allowed them to send sensitive instructions across borders without fear of interception. In wars, telegraph codes became both a weapon and a weakness. If an enemy captured your code book, your entire network of communications was compromised. Some nations printed their books on special paper designed to burn instantly if set alight, an early form of information security. As the century went on, telegraph codes grew stranger. Some codebooks banned words that looked too much like real language, fearing that clerks might misread them. Others created long lists of invented, almost magical-sounding words: Aztec, bumblebee, crimson, Delphic. Each stood for an entire message. The effect was almost poetic. To the casual observer, it looked like people were sending fragments of riddles across the wires. But not all codes were innocent. Criminals quickly discovered the system's potential. Smugglers used codes to arrange secret shipments. Conmen used them to pass instructions without arousing suspicion. And because telegraph operators often had no idea what the coded words meant, they were powerless to stop it. Some investigators claimed that entire financial frauds were carried out through telegrams that looked harmless on the surface, but were really intricate schemes written in cipher. By the late 19th century, telegraph companies began to push back. Some imposed rules that a coded word had to be pronounceable or limited messages to specific lengths. This forced code makers to grow even more creative. A whole industry of code books flourished, each one thicker than the last, with promises of saving money and keeping secrets. Titles like the Anglo-American Telegraphic Code or Lieber's Standard Telegraphic Code were staples in offices and trading houses. Some books ran to over 1,000 pages, filled with bizarre word lists that today read more like surrealist poetry than business language. And yet, with the rise of the telephone and later radio, many of these codebooks faded away. They were used less and less, tossed into drawers and eventually forgotten. Today, only fragments remain, dusty copies preserved in libraries or collectors' archives. Some have entire sections missing, as if someone tore out the most important pages to keep their secrets hidden. Others contain notes in the margins, reminders of deals made and fortunes lost. The mystery lies in the codes that didn't survive. For every codebook preserved, there are dozens that were destroyed or simply lost. Entire systems of communication, thousands of invented words and their hidden meanings have vanished into history. Without the key, many of the surviving telegrams from that era are unreadable gibberish, locked away in a language we no longer understand. What messages were hidden there? Secret affairs? Political betrayals? Lost treasure shipments? We may never know. In the mid-14th century, a strange and horrifying event unfolded on the Crimean Peninsula. The bustling port city of Caffa, sitting on the Black Sea, was under siege. But this was not just a typical clash of armies, or the usual medieval struggle for power. Instead, what took place at Caffa has been remembered as one of the earliest examples of biological warfare. It's a story where war, plague, and desperation collided, with consequences that may have helped unleash one of the deadliest pandemics in human history, the Black Death. Caffa was a thriving Genoese trading colony, full of merchants from Italy who had come to profit from the Silk Road. It was a valuable outpost, connecting Europe to the riches of Asia. But in 1346, this prosperous city found itself besieged by the Mongol Golden Horde, led by Khan Janibeg. The Mongols wanted to control the trade routes and expel the Genoese, who had long been a thorn in their side. The siege dragged on for months, with both sides stubbornly refusing to yield. Then something unexpected happened. As the Mongols camped outside the city walls, a terrifying disease began to spread among them. Men developed strange swellings, fevers, and painful deaths that came quickly. This was none other than the plague, the same disease that would soon devastate Europe. For the besieging army, it was a disaster. Warriors collapsed by the thousands, leaving the Mongols weakened and unable to sustain their campaign. But instead of simply retreating, the Mongols decided to turn their misfortune into a weapon. Chroniclers of the time describe a chilling scene: plague-ridden corpses being hurled over the city walls using catapults. Imagine the horror for the citizens of Caffa, watching diseased bodies arc through the sky before crashing into the streets and courtyards. Whether the Mongols believed this would infect the city or whether it was simply a desperate act of vengeance, the psychological terror it caused was immense. Inside Caffa, panic spread as fast as the disease itself. Some accounts claim the plague began to take hold within the walls after the corpses landed. Others suggest it was the escape of refugees from the city, merchants and sailors who fled by ship, that truly mattered. These fleeing survivors carried not just stories of the siege, but also rats and fleas infected with plague. From the Black Sea, they sailed back to Mediterranean ports like Constantinople, Genoa, and Venice. Within a few short years, Europe was engulfed in the Black Death, a pandemic that killed an estimated 25 to 50 million people. Historians still debate the details. Was the Mongols' grim tactic at Caffa truly the spark that ignited the Black Death in Europe? Or would the plague have arrived anyway, carried along trade routes from Asia? It's hard to know for certain, but the story of the siege captures the desperate measures people resorted to in times of crisis. It also highlights how war and disease were often intertwined in the medieval world, creating deadly combinations that reshaped history. The Caffa incident is often cited as one of the first documented cases of biological warfare, using disease as a weapon. Yet, in reality, humans had long experimented with similar tactics. Ancient armies sometimes poisoned wells, smeared arrows with toxins, or left rotting animal carcasses to spread sickness. But what happened at Caffa stood out because of its scale and its global consequences. Instead of a localized tragedy, this siege may have set into motion a pandemic that transformed continents. Even if the Mongol tactic didn't directly cause the Black Death in Europe, the symbolism is striking. A city under siege became a gateway through which plague entered a new world. The corpses catapulted over the walls became a dark metaphor for how easily disease can leap boundaries, crossing walls, seas, and nations. In the medieval mind, such an event was not just a military tactic, but a sign of divine wrath, a punishment from above made visible through human cruelty. The siege of Caffa remains a chilling reminder that warfare isn't always about swords, arrows, or cannons. Sometimes the deadliest weapons are invisible, microbes carried by fleas, rats, and desperate human acts. Whether or not the Mongols truly unleashed the Black Death on Europe through their grisly catapults, their siege has become a legend, one that warns us about the thin line between human conflict and natural disaster. In the long history of international disputes, wars have been fought over land, resources, religion, and politics. But in 1859, the United States and Britain nearly went to war over a pig. The setting was the San Juan Islands, a small chain of islands between Vancouver Island and the mainland of what is now Washington State. At the time, this region was disputed territory. The Oregon Treaty of 1846 had attempted to settle the boundary between US and British territory, placing it along the 49th parallel. But there was one problem. The treaty didn't clearly say which channel between the islands belonged to whom. As a result, both Americans and British claimed the San Juan Islands as their own. By the 1850s, the islands had a mixed population. American settlers farmed the land, while the Hudson's Bay Company, a British trading corporation, ran operations there. For a while, they coexisted in an uneasy peace. That peace ended on June 15, 1859, with the gunshot heard around, well, at least around the island. The trouble began when an American farmer named Lyman Cutler found a large black pig rooting in his vegetable garden. This wasn't the first time. It had happened before. The pig belonged to Charles Griffin, an Irish employee of the Hudson's Bay Company, who let his livestock roam freely. Frustrated at losing yet another crop of potatoes, Cutler grabbed his rifle and shot the pig. In most cases, such a dispute might be settled with compensation, but when Griffin demanded $100 for the loss, Cutler refused, saying the pig had been trespassing. Griffin reported the incident to British authorities, who threatened to arrest Cutler. Word of the arrest threat spread quickly, and soon the incident became more than just a neighbourly feud. It became a test of national pride. American settlers petitioned the US military for protection, fearing British law enforcement might try to take control of the island. The United States responded by sending Captain George Pickett of the 9th Infantry to the island with a small force. Pickett, who would later gain fame and infamy at Gettysburg during the American Civil War, was not exactly a diplomat. Upon arrival, he declared, "We'll make a Bunker Hill of it," making it clear he was ready for a fight. The British, not wanting to be shown up, sent 3 warships under the command of Rear Admiral Robert Baines. Soon, nearly 500 American troops faced off against 5 British warships and over 2,000 Royal Marines and sailors. The standoff was tense, Both sides dug in, cannons were positioned, and soldiers waited for orders. Here's the incredible part. Despite all this military build-up, no shots were fired, except the one that killed the pig. Admiral Baines refused to start a war over what he called the shooting of a pig, insisting that cooler heads should prevail. Eventually, both sides agreed to a temporary joint occupation of the island, while the dispute was settled through diplomacy. British and American troops camped on opposite ends of San Juan Island, sometimes visiting each other's camps and even holding athletic competitions together. The only real hostility was in the form of good-natured ribbing. The matter dragged on for over a decade. Finally, in 1872, the dispute was submitted to arbitration by Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, who ruled in favour of the United States. The British withdrew, and the San Juan Islands officially became American territory. So, in the end, the Pig War had only one casualty, the pig itself. No human lives were lost, and the war turned into one of history's most peaceful military standoffs. But the story still carries a few lessons. First, it's a reminder of how unclear treaties can lead to long-lasting disputes. Second, it shows how quickly small incidents can escalate when national pride is involved. And finally, it's proof that sometimes military restraint can prevent disaster. Both the Americans and the British had enough firepower to destroy each other's forces on the island, but neither side truly wanted another war. Today, San Juan Island is a peaceful tourist destination, and the old American and British camps are preserved as historical parks. Visitors can walk between them in minutes, crossing what was once a tense military line. As for the pig, its role in history is immortalized in local lore and museum exhibits. And while its untimely end nearly sparked an international conflict, it also gave the world one of the strangest names for a war ever recorded. The Pig War stands as a curious footnote in history, a moment when the fate of an island and relations between two powerful nations hinged on the fate of a potato-thieving hog. History often feels like a tapestry woven from the threads of wars, revolutions, inventions, and grand political movements. But if you look closely, between the familiar patterns of kings, generals, and treaties, you'll find stranger stitches, peculiar, absurd, or even tragic events that don't quite fit the great man narrative. The Pig War, the Affair of the Poisons, and the London beer flood remind us that history is not just the story of sweeping movements, but also of human folly, coincidence, and the unpredictable quirks of fate. The Pig War of 1859 stands as a perfect example of how easily two great nations, Britain and the United States, could have stumbled into armed conflict over something as small as a wandering hog. It wasn't really about the pig, of course. That unfortunate animal was simply the spark that revealed deeper tensions over unclear borders in the Pacific Northwest. Yet, the absurdity of the situation, troops massing, warships arriving, and officers on both sides ready to act, was tempered by a rare moment of restraint. Instead of exchanging cannon fire, cooler heads prevailed, and the matter was resolved with diplomacy. The Pig War reminds us that sometimes the biggest victory lies in not fighting at all. It also shows how human pride, petty grievances, and stubbornness can nearly tip the world into disaster over what, in hindsight, seems almost comical. The Affair of the Poisons in France, by contrast, was no laughing matter. Between 1677 and 1682, Paris was gripped by scandal. Whispers of poisonings, black magic, and secret rites reached the highest levels of Louis XIV's glittering court. This was a world where ambition could be deadly, and the line between superstition and reality blurred. Prominent figures, including members of the aristocracy, were implicated in a web of crime involving fortune-tellers, witches, and alleged satanic masses. While the official investigation sought to root out murder and treason, it also revealed a society rife with paranoia, where fear could be weaponized as easily as arsenic. Unlike the Pig War's harmless conclusion, the Affair of the Poisons ended in executions, imprisonments, and a lingering sense that even the Sun King's court could not escape the shadows of greed, fear, and moral decay. If the Pig War was farcical and the Affair of the Poisons was sinister, the London beer flood of 1814 was tragically surreal. In a working-class district of the city, a giant vat of beer burst, releasing more than 1 million litres of porter in a wave that flattened walls and swept people away. For the victims, there was no warning, just the sudden, thundering destruction of their homes by an unstoppable tide of alcohol. While it may sound absurd to modern ears, the flood was a disaster in every sense. Lives were lost, livelihoods destroyed, and the smell of beer lingered for months. It was also a sobering lesson in the dangers of poor industrial safety standards long before modern regulations took hold. When you place these three events side by side, an interesting truth emerges. The Pig War shows us that even potentially violent conflicts can be resolved peacefully when cooler heads prevail. The affair of the poisons warns of what happens when fear, ambition, and secrecy are allowed to fester unchecked. The London beer flood reminds us that not all disasters are born of malice. Some come from negligence, chance, or sheer bad luck. Together, they also highlight the unpredictable nature of history. Sometimes a single gunshot can plunge nations into decades of war. Other times, a shot aimed at a pig can be the last bullet fired in a dispute. Sometimes whispered accusations can bring down noble families. Other times, silence can preserve peace. And occasionally, the most memorable tragedy of a year might not be a battle or a political crisis, but a flood of beer sweeping through the streets. Most importantly, these stories challenge the way we think about the past. It's easy to assume that history is shaped only by the deliberate actions of powerful people or by unavoidable impersonal forces. But in reality, chance, personality, and small decisions or mistakes often set the course of events. A pig wandering into a garden, a suspicious death in Paris, a cracked iron ring on a beer vat. None of these were meant to become major historical episodes, yet they did. In their own ways, these events also carry lessons for the present. They remind us to approach disputes with patience, to keep a wary eye on those who exploit fear, and to never underestimate the impact of safety, oversight, and responsibility in our industries and communities. They show that the boundary between the ridiculous and the catastrophic is sometimes thinner than we think. History, then, is not just about the grand, sweeping changes of empires rising and falling. It's also about the odd, the tragic, and the unexpected, moments that, though small in the grand scheme, reveal the fragility and unpredictability of human life. The Pig War, the affair of the poisons, and the London beer flood each tell a different kind of story, but together they leave us with one lasting thought. The past is full of surprises, and sometimes it's the strangest events that teach us the most.